Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Connor Mercer, and this is Connor Collects. I discuss a brief history of gaming, my thoughts on said history, and my experiences collecting video games. Today, we'll be talking about the end of the 1990s moving into the 2000s and 2010s. This is where things really began to speed up and blend together. In the mid-1990s, Sega had begun its decline. It had a strong start with the Genesis, but flop after flop hurt consumer faith in the brand, and Sega was losing hope and money. In 1998 in Japan and 1999 in America, Sega released the Sega Dreamcast console to short-lived critical and commercial acclaim. Unfortunately, it had a few problems, many of which weren't necessarily its own fault. As we've established in our last episode, the PlayStation was a killer hit. The Sega Saturn, released to combat the PS1, was quickly abandoned, and Sega decided they would instead move on to the next console generation entirely. The fifth generation, consisting of the PlayStation and the struggling Nintendo 64, was in high gear, but Sega believed by beating everyone to the punch, they'd have a fighting chance in the sixth. There's an important thing to note. A lot of people, particularly young people, believe the terms CD and DVD are interchangeable. This is false. A lot of people also believe that CDs are for audio and DVDs are for video. This is mostly true. In reality, both the CD and DVD are two different formats of optical disc. It just so happens that both the general public and manufacturers decided that CDs would be best suited for music and DVDs would be best suited for video. Fun fact, the video CD format was briefly popular in the Asian market, and the audio DVD was briefly popular as a niche. The video CD obviously wasn't as big as the video DVD, which is 700 megabytes compared to about 5 gigabytes, so it looked only slightly better than the VHS. I don't actually have any audio DVDs, but from what I've heard, because there's so much more storage space, they generally sound better than audio CDs. Anyway, the CD and DVD discs are similar to the naked eye, but are structurally different, and DVDs appear to be the disc of the future to many. DVDs were also incredibly expensive in the 90s. The Nintendo 64 used cartridges, which could hold about 64 megabytes of data at best. The PS1 and Saturn used CDs, which could hold 700 megabytes and standard CD music. Another fun fact, you can put a Sega Saturn disc in a CD player and listen to the game's soundtrack. It's pretty cool. Anyway, the PlayStation became known for its pathetic anti-copy protection, and many people were buying blank CDs at the store and pirating PlayStation games. Sega took notice and decided that the Dreamcast would use its own proprietary format, which was essentially a CD with the data packets, on the silver side of the disc, literally burned closer together. This gave the new GD format a storage size of an entire gigabyte. That's 1,000 megabytes. With the data packets on the GD so close together, Sega believed that the Dreamcast would be invulnerable to pirates. Unfortunately, they were proven wrong pretty quickly when pirates discovered a hidden feature in the Dreamcast referred to as the MIL CD player. The MIL CD was another proprietary format Sega made, mainly for having neat menus and videos play over audio CDs. An example would be a home karaoke disc, which is mostly music but has lyrics on the screen you can look at. Sega never actually made a whole lot of these MIL CD discs, but a flaw in programming meant that the hackers could trick pirated Dreamcast games on standard CDs to boot as MIL CDs. In layman's terms, hackers tricked the Dreamcast into running pirated games as a fancy alternative CD. With essentially the only benefit of the GD format being made obsolete, the Dreamcast was stuck with a single gigabyte of data per game. Showing up early to the party also meant that the Dreamcast was not nearly as powerful as consoles yet to come. When Sony announced the PlayStation 2 in 1999, not long before the Dreamcast released in America, many gamers opted to simply wait for the PS2 instead. The PlayStation 2 was the first video game console to use DVDs as its primary format. An extremely small number of PS2 games were shipped on CDs to cut costs, but most games were on DVDs. Additionally, the PS2 functioned as a full-fledged DVD player. Launching at $299 US, the PS2 was an instant success, and sales for the Dreamcast stopped almost overnight. A lot of people credit the PS2 for popularizing the DVD format because it was so much cheaper than other DVD players. There's no data to corroborate this that I'm aware of, but I would not be surprised if many of the PS2 sales were simply people who wanted a cheap DVD player. Sega reorganized as a third-party studio in 2001. In their defense, when you're up against what would eventually become the best-selling video game console of all time, you probably wouldn't last long either. Another curveball happened during the sixth generation, the rise of Xbox. In 2001, Microsoft threw their hat in the ring with the Xbox. Microsoft had a bit of a different strategy than the other guys. They were going to start buying game studios instead of making their own. In 2000, Microsoft acquired struggling developer Bungie. Bungie was in the process of making a game called Halo, a third-person shooter about a cyborg. Development had been staggering for a while, but Microsoft's purchase of Bungie kickstarted the development into high gear. Although, looking back, when you're now in charge of the flagship title for a brand new video game console, you'd probably want to kickstart it too. Fans of Halo probably rioted when they heard me say third-person shooter and cyborg, but I beg you, lower your pitchforks. Development pre-Xbox did in fact involve a third-person game with a cyborg protagonist. The acquisition of Bungie by Microsoft meant the game was moving from home computers directly to the Xbox, which meant players were going to be using a controller instead of a keyboard and mouse. Bungie thought it would be easier and simpler to switch to a first-person perspective to accommodate the gamepad. Later revisions in the story changed the cyborg into an enhanced human super soldier named Master Chief. Halo made the Xbox a household name when the pair launched in 2001. It was not an immediate runaway success, but Halo was purchased with almost half of every Xbox console sold. The release of Halo 2 in 2004 finally cemented the franchise as a household name. I did mention that Microsoft planned to win by buying other studios, and they didn't stop with Bungie. In the early 2000s, as game development got more and more expensive, Rare, who was at one point one of Nintendo's best studios, realized they wouldn't fare well if Nintendo only owned a minority stake in the company. Rare sought buyers, and Microsoft quickly swooped in. In 2002, Microsoft bought Rare in full, ending their long-lasting partnership with Nintendo. Alongside the Xbox launched the Nintendo GameCube also in 2001. The GameCube was not the success that Nintendo had hoped for, and even though it wasn't a commercial failure, Nintendo realized they needed to change course. They were not in nearly as dire straits as Sega was, however, but they decided that they didn't want to discover how it felt. The best analogy I can think of is this. Sega shot themselves in the foot twice, and when they came to their senses, they got shot in the leg by Sony. Nintendo sprained their ankles twice. Obviously, they were still making money, enough to survive, but they knew if they kept coming in second and third place, they weren't going to last much longer. Nintendo began to shift their entire home console strategy. Before we get into that, however, we should talk about something I left out in the last episode, the Game Boy series. The Game Boy was an unbelievably successful handheld console launched in 1989. It featured a monochrome screen, a control scheme similar to the NES, and about 30 hours of battery life on 4 AA's. It was so successful that Nintendo didn't release a successor until 1998 with the release of the Game Boy Color. The Color was more of a holdover, though, while Nintendo began work on a true next-generation handheld successor, later dubbed the Game Boy Advance. The GBA launched in 2001 to lucrative success. By the time the dust settled, the GBA had sold over 80 million consoles. Even if Nintendo's home console business crumbled after the GameCube, their handheld business could probably support them for the rest of time. Anyway, Nintendo got to work on their new game plan for the 7th generation, the Blue Ocean. A Blue Ocean strategy is essentially making an entirely new market and then dominating it. Nintendo saw the potential for a casual market, a market of people not necessarily willing to spend hundreds of dollars on the most powerful hardware, but were willing to try anything as long as it was fun. Before they used this strategy in the home console business, however, they had to take a test run. In 2003, Nintendo announced that their next piece of hardware would not be a successor to the Game Boy Advance or GameCube, but something else entirely. Retrospectively, it was in fact a successor to the Game Boy Advance. But at the time, Nintendo didn't want to burn any bridges. If the so-called Nintendo DS failed, they wanted to be able to fall back onto the still successful Game Boy line. The Nintendo DS, released in 2004, is a handheld console with 2 screens, with the bottom being a touchscreen. The DS sold record numbers and proved the feasibility of just being different. Meanwhile, Sony wanted in on the handheld Pi. They knew that they had the home console market cornered and believed that they could finish off Nintendo in the handheld market too. In late 2004, they released the PlayStation Portable, a more traditional handheld. The PSP saw modest success, but there was no stopping the Nintendo DS. As the 7th generation of consoles took off in the handheld department, the Big Three finished their home consoles. This era would be unlike anything seen since SNES v Genesis. The Xbox 360 was first to the party in late 2005. It featured a revamped version of Xbox Live, the multiplayer service originally featured on the first Xbox. The 360 was plagued with hardware errors that cost Microsoft a lot of money and a lot of goodwill. The following year, in 2006, Sony and Nintendo finally made it to the party. The PlayStation 3 launched at either $499 and $599 depending on how much storage you got, and with a fairly unremarkable library of games, many of which were available on the 360. Multi-platform releases are common, but a serious lack of good PS3 exclusives led to the PS3 has no games meme and a serious lack of confidence in the platform. The Nintendo Wii was the last to the party in late 2006. Sticking to the Blue Ocean strategy, the Wii was a different type of game console. Instead of a traditional gamepad controller, the Wii featured a motion control setup involving a TV remote styled wand and a plug in thumbstick. Bundled with Wii Sports, the Wii was another unparalleled success from Nintendo. It really was the perfect storm. The 360 was heavily anticipated, but hardware flaws led to a lot of controversy. The PS3 was too expensive and didn't have nearly enough games to support it. The Wii was inexpensive, reliable, and launched with quite possibly the most easy to understand, fun to master game ever made, and almost immediately the Wii took first place. The Wii was known for its ease of use and simplicity, and many people who had previously not cared for video games wanted in on the action. My mother absolutely hates video games. She resents the fact that video games exist, and yet in 2010, she too was playing Zumba Fitness on Wii. While the Wii reigned in a world of its own, the 360 and PS3 fought their way back to relevance. Halo 3 had a massive marketing campaign, the likes of which the world hadn't seen since Super Mario Bros. 3. Halo 3 launched exclusively for the Xbox 360 in 2007, made $170 million in sales on the first day, and sold 8 million copies by 2008. Halo 3 was used as evidence by the mainstream press that gaming had hit the mainstream, so to speak. Meanwhile, the PlayStation 3 had to turn course completely. An aggressive marketing campaign, price cuts, and a headfirst dive into brand new games made the PS3 a viable option for gamers. Uncharted, Little Big Planet, God of War, all proved that the PS3 did in fact have games. Multi-platform hits like Grand Theft Auto and Call of Duty finally started to pick up steam on the PS3. The Xbox 360 was still beating the PS3, but nothing compared to the might of the Wii. By the time the dust settled, the Wii had sold over 100 million consoles, putting it at the top third best-selling home console ever made before it was shoved down to fourth place by the PS4 and eventually fifth place by Nintendo's own Switch. Nintendo was in a league of their own, so during the 7th generation, it was up to Microsoft and Sony to fight for second place. Microsoft and Sony, each trying to upstage the Wii, took a gamble on the casual market a few years in. This gamble failed. Both the PS3 and 360 released motion controllers in 2010, but because Microsoft didn't realize it was a losing battle in time, Sony was able to jump back on track with massive exclusives and their continued aggressive marketing. Microsoft let their guard down for just long enough, and by the end, the PlayStation 3 had just barely outsold the Xbox 360. Between 87 million PS3s, 84 million 360s were sold. The 6th and 7th generation of gaming is where I grew up. As a kid, we had a PlayStation 2 and a Game Boy Advance. I wasn't allowed to play anything too violent, so while my brother played Call of Duty and Jak and Daxter, I played SpongeBob, Battle for Bikini Bottom. On the Game Boy, I had a lot more games. I had Super Mario Bros. 2, I had Mario Kart Super Circuit, I had the SpongeBob movie game, you name it, I had it. I also ended up getting a DS around the same time, with New Super Mario Bros. And SpongeBob's Atlantis Scorpantis being my go-tos. I wasn't much older when we got the Wii around 2007. This is where I really got into Mario. Super Mario Galaxy, Mario Kart Wii, Mario Party 8, you name it. The Wii was also the first online console I had, and Nintendo offered dozens and dozens of classic games on the Wii Shop. I got every Mario game they had, the original Mario trilogy, Super Mario World, Super Mario 64, Mario Party 2, Mario Kart 64, Mario Golf, the list goes on and on and on and on. The Wii can also play GameCube games. I didn't actually have a GameCube when I was super young, but one game that me, my cousin, and brother all loved was Cars on the GameCube. Yes, the Cars with Lightning McQueen. You could drive all around Radiator Springs and race in the Piston Cup. Cars on GameCube was the first indication to young me that there was more out there than just the PS2 and Wii. I eventually got a GameCube at GameStop when I was in middle school just to have it, but by then I'd already gotten about a dozen Mario games I was playing on Wii. One of my favorite GameCube games is a game called Animal Crossing. I grew up with the sequel on the Wii, which is still one of my favorite games ever, but the GameCube version is just different enough for me to go back to it every now and then. It still has a GameStop sticker on it. Used, sold for $6. I don't peel it off because it reminds me of how good I had it as a kid. GameCubes and GameCube games cost so much money these days that I essentially struck gold by getting everything when they were cheapest. Animal Crossing for GameCube goes for at least $100 on eBay these days, and most of the other Nintendo-made stuff isn't cheap either. Eventually, we got an Xbox 360. I didn't really use it that much at first, but my brother was really into Halo and Call of Duty. I eventually made my own Xbox Live account to play Minecraft after a friend at summer camp told me to try it out. I didn't get super into first-person shooters until a few years ago, so only recently did I start collecting stuff like Halo and Call of Duty. We never had a PS3 while it was relevant, although there was a time when I really wanted one. In 2016, my family took a trip to Hawaii. We stayed at a Hilton resort with PS3s in every room. They even had a kiosk in the lobby where you could rent games. My brother recognized the game he had on PS2 as a kid, Sly Cooper, and found a PS3 version on the kiosk. Fiddling around with a PS3 in Hawaii really made me want one for myself. In 2020, right before the pandemic hit, I finally got a PS3 for cheap at my local retro store, so I could play all the HD remasters of all the PS2 games I'd missed out on as a kid. The first game I got was the Jak and Daxter trilogy, and I'm still stuck on Jak 2. When my brother found out I'd gotten into Jak and Daxter, he told me that Jak 2 was probably the hardest game he'd ever played, so I don't feel too bad about myself. I also got a copy of Minecraft, of course, just in case I needed it. During the pandemic, me and my dad were talking about the PSP. As kids, me and my brother each got our own Game Boy Advance and we each got our own DS. But for some reason, only he had a PSP. I asked my dad why, and he said that he did actually get me a PSP when I was a kid, but I never used it. Once he realized I didn't care about it, he kept it for himself. The PSP used a format called the UMD, which is a small disc encased in plastic. Because it used a disc instead of a cartridge, there was enough storage space that Sony actually used UMD as a movie format and asked studios like Universal and Disney to put their movies on UMD. Since the only UMD player ever produced was the PSP itself, my dad used it as an inexpensive portable movie player back in the day. And he still has most of his dozens and dozens of movies. Because of this, he didn't want to give me my quote-unquote PSP back after so many years, so we went online and found a new one. It was perfect timing, too. Around the same time, my friend Nick was selling off all of his old gaming stuff. A lot of it was for the PSP, and I got to take a few games off his hands. One game, Persona 3, was actually worth $200 at one point, but Nick actually let me have it for $5. I think he just wanted to get rid of it. These days, I actually use my PSP the same way my dad did to watch movies. There's a shockingly large amount of stuff on UMD. It also helps that the PSP has video out, predating the Nintendo Switch by over a decade, and I can watch my movies in bed and on the big screen. The most recent addition to my collection is the original Xbox. Like the Wii, the Xbox 360 has backwards compatibility, which means it can play games from its predecessor. However, the Wii is essentially just more powerful GameCube hardware, which means any GameCube game running on Wii is running natively with no tricks. Original Xbox games on Xbox 360 are emulated, which means the Xbox 360 is using its software to do all the work the original Xbox would have. It's all very technical, but essentially, emulation on the 360 meant that every game supported had to be tailored to work and not every game was supported as a result. About half of the Xbox's library was playable on the 360, but that still left about half stranded on the original Xbox. Even Xbox games that do work on the 360 just don't run as well, so I figured I'd grab myself an Xbox while they were still relatively cheap. Because Xbox games had to be tailored on the 360, Microsoft had to ask permission from many developers because they were technically re-releasing the games in a new format. Many developers couldn't accept even if they wanted to because some games were licensed. Essentially, Person A makes a game, such as James Bond, for Person B. A few years later, Person C asks for said game. Person A wants to give it to Person C, but can't because the game is owned by Person B. James Bond isn't just a highly successful movie franchise, it's also a fairly successful game franchise, headlined by the award-winning GoldenEye 007 on the Nintendo 64. Rare lost the James Bond license in the late 90s to Electronic Arts, which meant that Bond games were no longer locked to Nintendo. I wanted to get at least one Bond game on every console, including the Xbox, but none of the Xbox games in the series were supported on 360. James Bond Everything or Nothing was the first original Xbox game I got that didn't work on the 360, and it was the first game I played on my original Xbox. I also had a few original Xbox games already, since most of them worked on the 360. Once I got my Xbox, I also got a second copy of Halo 2, because you can actually connect two Xboxes together to play multiplayer on two TVs. The game room in my house has a weird setup. There are two TVs stacked on top of each other because last year we renovated the house. One room that used to have a TV is now my mom's wine shelf room, so that TV was moved to the game room. It's perfect for what's called System Link multiplayer, but I'm still waiting for all of my friends' schedules to match so we can play the damn thing already. Even after I got an Xbox, a PS3, and everything you could imagine, I still go back to the GameCube the most. I've got a huge pile of GameCube games I still need to beat. Metroid Prime, Star Fox Assault, Super Mario Sunshine, you name it. There are also a few games I still haven't gotten yet. One game I really want is F-Zero GX, a futuristic high-speed racing game. As for the Wii, I've had it for so long that I pretty much have every game I can ever want for it. Although, there is a collectible steelbook of the Metroid Prime trilogy on Wii. That's next on the list. There's still a whole bunch of Xbox and Xbox 360 games I want to get. I want to get all the Sonic games on Xbox. I think it'd be pretty funny if I had Shadow the Hedgehog and Sonic 06. I know I've said that I usually only get games I intend to play, but I think it'd be neat to have them on the shelf, especially since everyone thinks they're so terrible. There isn't a lot left on the PS3 that I want to get. The PS3 has no games meme isn't exactly inaccurate. Everything on the PS3 was ported to the PS4 pretty much immediately, since the PS4 doesn't have any backwards compatibility. Plus, a lot of the stuff just doesn't interest me. One game that does is the original Little Big Planet. I've always loved games where you can make stuff and mess around with them, and Little Big Planet looks like a lot of fun. I also want a physical copy of the Sly Cooper trilogy. I have all three games digitally on the PS3 store, but I remember playing it in Hawaii after we rented it, and I think about how cool it would be if I could bring it full circle. There's a whole lot of Game Boy games I still want. I mostly stuck to the Mario games and the SpongeBob games growing up, so I don't have a lot of the heavy-hitting Nintendo games. I really want a complete in-box copy of all the Metroid and Zelda Game Boy games, but they're so damn expensive that I don't think I can justify it. I want Metroid Fusion on the shelf so bad. The box art looks so cool. It has Samus Aran, famous bounty hunter, in her cool, sleek blue space armor on what looks like an alien planet. I've been trying to get into Metroid recently, if you can't tell. I've beaten Metroid Zero Mission, which is a GBA remake of the first game from the NES, which I played on the Wii U console. Not at all confusing. These days, I'm playing the Prime games on GameCube, but I'm not very good at them. I'll beat them eventually. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all for today's episode of Connor Collects. Next time on the show, I'll discuss life after the 7th generation, including the transition to the digital era. I will also be discussing my thoughts on modern gaming, which, spoiler alert, I'm not the biggest fan of. There's a lot of stuff in modern gaming that I just don't really like, and next time I'll go into detail on why. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and please be sure to rate and subscribe if you want to hear more. Have a great one.